Julianne Croft believed the world operated on two principles: leverage and velocity. Everything was a negotiation, and the person who moved fastest with the most force always won. She applied this philosophy from the boardroom of Croft Executive Air, a private charter empire built on her father's money and her own ruthless efficiency, down to the thermostat of her Gulfstream G650. It was currently 2 degrees too warm, a minor but irritating friction against the smooth fabric of her day. She sat in a cream leather seat, the cabin a silent, pressurized tube hurtling through the stratosphere at just under the speed of sound. Below, the patchwork of the Midwest was an abstraction, a problem for other people. Her problem was a flickering light on the avionics panel, a tiny amber ghost that her chief pilot assured her was a known intermittent issue. Intermittent is another word for unreliable, Robert, she had said into the cockpit intercom, her voice flat and cold. When we land, I want the lead maintenance engineer from the FBO on the tarmac. I don't care what it costs. I have a meeting in Zurich in 36 hours. This aircraft will be ready. Her assistant, David Chen, sat opposite her, his laptop open but his attention fixed on his employer. He had learned to read the subtle metrics of her mood, the tightness in her jaw, the way her fingers tapped a staccato rhythm on her phone's glass screen. He saw a storm gathering and made a quiet note to have a car ready for the engineer and to pre-authorize the payment, whatever it was. Julianne Croft did not tolerate delays, and she paid handsomely to eliminate them. What she would not pay for, however, was perceived incompetence or, even worse, disrespect for her time. She saw them as the same thing. The jet began its smooth descent toward a private airfield outside of Chicago, a place of quiet wealth and transactional necessity. Julianne was already focused on Zurich, the flickering amber light, a problem she had already delegated, and therefore, a problem that was already solved. She had leveraged her money and applied velocity. The world, as always, would bend to her will. 300 miles away, in a different world entirely, Elias Vance wiped a thin film of hydraulic fluid from a torque wrench. His hangar was not the gleaming white cathedral of a corporate flight department but a simple, functional space at the forgotten end of a municipal airfield. Everything in it had a purpose and a place. Tools lay not in chaotic piles but in foam-cut drawers. Manuals, some dating back to the dawn of the jet age, were arranged on steel shelves with library-like precision. The air smelled of solvent, metal, and brewed coffee. It was a clean smell, the smell of order imposed on complex machinery. His work was the opposite of Julianne's. It was not about velocity, it was about patience. It was not about leverage, it was about correctness. His son, Leo, sat at a small, sturdy desk in the corner, meticulously assembling a complex plastic model of a Saturn V rocket. At 10 years old, Leo had his father's quiet intensity and steady hands. He rarely spoke when he was working, his focus absolute. A stray piece of plastic flashing, an improperly seated joint, these were problems to be solved with calm deliberation, not frustration. Elias watched him for a moment, a rare, soft smile touching his lips. The boy was a better version of himself. He was the reason for this quiet life, for this small hangar at the edge of nowhere. He was the reason Elias Vance, a man who once led the diagnostics team on the most advanced experimental flight systems in the world, was now content to rebuild carburetors for crop dusters and patch the fabric wings of vintage biplanes. The work was honest, the hours were his own, and every evening he was home to have dinner with his son. He had made a promise to his late wife, Anna, in the sterile quiet of a hospital room, a promise that Leo would have a father, not just a photograph of one. He had kept that promise. He had traded the world of hypersonic velocities and bleeding-edge composites for a life measured in the slow, satisfying clicks of a well-made wrench and the quiet hum of his son's concentration. The phone on his desk rang, its shrill noise an intrusion on the hangar's peace. He answered it with a simple, "Vance." He listened more than he spoke, his eyes drifting to a complex wiring diagram pinned to a corkboard. The voice on the other end was hurried, stressed, talking about a Collins Pro Line 4 avionics suite in a G650, a recurring fault in a legacy interface bridge. Elias felt a flicker of something, a ghost of his old life. He knew that system. He had helped write the diagnostic manual for it 15 years ago. Marcus Thorne adjusted his tie as he leaned against a workbench in Elias's hangar, careful not to smudge his suit. He was a lawyer, a man who lived in a world of precisely worded documents and adversarial conversations, and the quiet functionality of this space always seemed to calm him. He and Elias had been friends since college, two different minds drawn together by a shared respect for competence. He watched Elias carefully repin a connector, his movements economical and sure. "So, Croft executive heir," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "That's a big fish, Eli. A very big, very rich fish." "It's just a machine, Marcus," Elias replied without looking up. "Wires and code. Same as any other." "Not quite. Julianne Croft doesn't see it that way. To her, it's a symbol. A tool. And the people who fix it are interchangeable parts. I've seen her legal team in action. They're sharks. Be careful." Elias set the connector down and finally turned to his friend. "I'm always careful. That's the job." Marcus sighed. He knew this side of Elias. The calm, almost frustrating stoicism that masked one of the sharpest technical minds he had ever known. He had been there when Elias was a rising star at a legendary aerospace development firm, the kind of place that did not officially exist. He had seen the accolades, the patents, the almost reverential way senior engineers spoke of his ability to diagnose problems that left entire teams baffled. He had also been there for the aftermath, after Anna's sudden illness, when Elias had walked away from it all without a second glance. "I know," Marcus said, his voice softening. "I just worry. You're content here, and I'm glad for that. But you're capable of so much more. This woman, she could be an opportunity, or she could be a disaster. People like her don't operate on principles of fairness. They operate on power. Power doesn't make a differential amplifier work correctly," Elias stated simply. He picked up a multimeter, its leads trailing like surgical instruments. The laws of physics are immune to negotiation. That was the core of Elias Vance. He believed in immutable truths. A circuit was either complete or it was open. A component was within tolerance or it was not. A promise was kept or it was broken. His withdrawal from the high-stakes world of advanced aerospace had not been a retreat from a challenge, but a deliberate move toward a life governed by principles he could trust. The corporate world, he had learned, was full of intermittent faults you could not measure with a multimeter. His wife's death had been the catalyst, the catastrophic failure that forced a complete system overhaul. He had to reboot his entire life, stripping it down to its essential components: his son, his work, his integrity. "Just get it in writing," Marcus advised, pushing himself off the workbench. "A simple work order. Scope of work, estimated cost. Something I can use if she decides to play games." "I will," Elias said. But he knew, even as he said it, that the kind of people who required lawyers were often the kind of people who found ways around them. He would rely on something more robust than a contract. He would rely on the regulations, on the unbending, bureaucratic precision of the Federal Aviation Administration. He would do the job correctly, and he would document it correctly. That was his shield and his sword. He turned his attention back to the work, the outside world and its powerful, impatient people fading away. In the hangar, with his tools and his son, the world made sense. It was a closed system, and he was its master. The summons came from a frantic man named David Chen. He explained the situation with the G650 in a torrent of words, the pressure from his boss, Julianne Croft, evident in every syllable. They had already had the FBO's top engineer look at it, a man who had simply shaken his head and recommended they fly a specialist in from the manufacturer's headquarters in Savannah. That would take 2 days, minimum. Unacceptable. A desperate search for an independent avionics specialist with experience on legacy Collins systems had led them, through a series of reluctant referrals, to a name. Vance. A man who apparently worked out of a private hangar and did not even have a website. Elias agreed to look at the aircraft. He left Leo with a trusted neighbor, a retired pilot's widow, and drove his old but immaculately maintained pickup truck to the glittering private terminal. He was met on the tarmac by David Chen, who looked profoundly relieved. David was dressed in a slim-fit suit that probably cost more than Elias's truck, but his face was pale with stress. He led Elias to the Gulfstream, a machine of impossible grace and power. Elias walked around the jet once, his eyes taking in the tight seams, the flush rivets, the massive, silent engines. He was not awed by its beauty or its price tag. He saw a collection of systems, a complex interplay of mechanics, hydraulics, and electronics that had to work in perfect harmony. He saw a problem to be solved. He entered the cockpit, the scent of leather and ozone a familiar welcome. The chief pilot, a man with graying temples and a weary expression, pointed to the offending screen. "It's the number 2 flight management system," the pilot explained. "It keeps losing its data linked to the inertial reference unit. We've swapped the boxes, checked the connections. Nothing. It's deep in the system. The logs show a recurring bus failure, but the bus itself checks out." Elias nodded, his mind already mapping the system architecture. He asked a few quiet, precise questions that made the pilot and co-pilot exchange a surprised glance. This was not a part swapper. This man understood the theory. He knew the ghost in the machine. Just as he was about to access the maintenance diagnostic computer, the cabin door opened and Julianne Croft stepped into the cockpit. She was a whirlwind of expensive wool and sharp perfume. She did not look at the pilots or her assistant. Her gaze fell on Elias, taking in his worn flannel shirt, his clean but oil-stained work pants, and his steel-toed boots. It was a look that lasted no more than a second, but it contained a complete and dismissive assessment. "You're the mechanic?" she asked. The word hung in the air, weighted with condescension. "I am," Elias said, his voice even. "Have you found the problem?" "I'm beginning my diagnosis now." She glanced at her watch, a wafer-thin platinum thing. "I don't have time for a prolonged diagnosis. I need a solution. David tells me you are the expert. So, be an expert. What will it take to fix it?" Elias met her impatient stare. "It will take what it takes. I need to trace the fault. It's likely a failing component in the interface bridge or a compromised data line in the avionics bay. Once I identify the point of failure, I can determine the repair." "Fine," she snapped, cutting him off. "Let's talk numbers. What's your worst-case scenario? Give me a figure so I can approve it and you can get to work." Elias considered. Sourcing a replacement bridge was impossible. He would have to rebuild it at the component level. That meant hours of delicate, painstaking work. If it was a compromised line, that meant tracing it through tightly packed wire bundles. A job like this, done properly, could be anywhere from $50,000 to $70,000, depending on what I find. Julianne Croft actually laughed. It was not a sound of humor, but of disbelief and insult. $70,000. For a flickering light? My dear man, you are either a charlatan or you have a very inflated sense of your own importance. David Chin flinched. The pilot stared straight ahead at the windscreen. Elias did not react. He simply held her gaze. "That is the price for my expertise and my time. It is the price to do it correctly, so it never happens again." She studied him, her eyes cold and calculating. She was used to people who flinched, who stammered, who immediately lowered their price. Elias did none of these things. He stood there like a rock, a statement of fact. She needed her jet. He was, apparently, the only person who could fix it in her time frame. It was a negotiation, and he was not budging. Leverage. She had the money. He had the knowledge. "Fine," she said, her voice clipped. "Fix it. Send the bill to David. But I will tell you this, if this aircraft is not on that taxiway, engine spooled and ready for departure at 0600 tomorrow, you will not see a single dime. And I will make sure every FBO in this state knows your name as a man who makes promises he cannot keep." She turned and swept out of the cockpit without another word. David Chin gave Elias an apologetic look. I'll get you a purchase order number." "A signed work order would be better," Elias said quietly. She doesn't really do that," David stammered. "Her word is considered binding." Elias nodded slowly. He understood perfectly. Julianne Croft operated in a world above paperwork, a world of verbal commands and immediate obedience. He, however, lived in a world of documentation, where unwritten work was work that had never happened. He looked at the flickering amber light. The challenge was no longer just technical. He would fix the machine. But he would also follow the rules. He would follow them with a precision she could not possibly comprehend. With the hangar door sealed against the night, the Gulfstream's cockpit was a bubble of focused silence. Elias worked under the cool, shadowless light of a portable LED lamp. The world outside, Julianne Croft, her threats, her money, ceased to exist. There was only the machine and the problem. He had bypassed the flight management computer's own limited diagnostics and patched his laptop directly into the avionics bus, running a deep-level analysis program he had written himself years ago. The data scrolled across his screen, a river of hexadecimal code that was, to him, as readable as a book. He saw the faint, almost imperceptible signal degradation the pilots had described. It was not a consistent failure, but a series of microfaults, a stutter in the flow of information between the inertial navigation system and the flight computer. It was like listening to a conversation with a single, crucial word dropping out every few minutes. The system could compensate most of the time, but eventually, it would lose the thread and throw an error. He traced the fault to its source. It was not in the primary boxes, as the FBO mechanic had assumed. It was, as he had suspected, in the ARINC 429 interface bridge, a small, unassuming gray box buried deep in the avionics bay behind a tangle of wiring. Getting to it was a job in itself, requiring the careful removal of 3 other essential components. He worked methodically, labeling each connector, bagging each set of screws. His movements were fluid and efficient, born of thousands of hours spent inside the metallic guts of complex aircraft. There was no wasted effort. With the bridge finally on his workbench in the jet's cabin, he opened the casing. To a layperson, the circuit board inside was a miniature city of tiny components. To Elias, it was a schematic brought to life. He used a magnifying lamp and a high-resolution multimeter, testing the circuit trace by trace. And there it was. A hairline fracture in a solder joint on a logic chip, almost invisible to the naked eye. A flaw born of thousands of heat cycles, of microscopic vibrations. It was not broken, not yet. It was just intermittent. Unreliable. Repair was a delicate surgery. He would not just reflow the solder. That was a temporary fix. A patch. Julianne Croft was paying for a solution. He would desolder the entire chip, clean the contacts on the board and the chip itself, and then, using a binocular microscope to guide his hand, he would solder it back into place with a military-grade silver alloy that had superior thermal and vibration resistance. It was a level of care that went far beyond standard maintenance procedure. It was a master's touch. Leo had fallen asleep on a makeshift bed of blankets in the corner of the hangar office before Elias had even started the main repair. Now, in the deep quiet of 3 a.m., Elias worked on, fueled by black coffee and an unwavering focus. He sourced a replacement chip from his own private stock of new old components, a collection of rare and obsolete electronics he had acquired over the years. He knew that simply reseating the old chip was a risk, a microscopic internal flaw could remain. He would replace it. He would make it better than new. The soldering was an art form. The steady hand, the precise application of heat, the perfect, gleaming joint. He worked his way through the board, reinforcing other key connections, replacing 2 capacitors that showed signs of aging, even though they were still technically within tolerance. This was his signature. He did not just fix the problem presented, he diagnosed and fixed the problems that were coming. He was not just a mechanic, he was a restorer. He was returning the system to a state of ideal function. By 4:30 a.m., the bridge was reassembled and reinstalled in the avionics bay. He reconnected every wire, torqued every screw to its precise specification. He powered up the systems in sequence, watching the screens flicker to life. He ran his diagnostic program again. The signal was perfect. A clean, strong, unwavering stream of data. The amber light was gone, and it would not be coming back. The final step was the most crucial. He opened his laptop and logged into the FAA's maintenance portal. He began to fill out a Form 337, the official record for a major repair or alteration. He described the fault, his diagnostic procedure, and the exact nature of the repair, including the part numbers of the components he had replaced and the specifications of the solder he had used. It was a document of profound legal weight in the world of aviation. An aircraft's airworthiness certificate depended on the accuracy and completeness of these forms. He detailed every step with the same precision he had used in the repair itself. He listed the work performed, the date, his name, and his airframe and powerplant license number. He saved the draft. He then prepared his invoice. He calculated the hours, the cost of the rare components he had used, and a fee for the rush, after-hours service. The total came to $68,500. It was a fair price for the level of work performed, for the solution he had provided. He printed the invoice and a copy of the draft Form 337. He placed them in a neat folder. At 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes ahead of Julianne Croft's deadline, he closed up the avionics bay, cleaned his tools, and walked out of the silent jet into the cool, pre-dawn air. The work was done. The machine was perfect. Now, the human part of the equation would begin. David Chin saw the invoice come through on his email at 6:05 a.m., just as Julianne Croft was stepping out of her chauffeured car onto the tarmac. He opened the PDF and his stomach tightened. $68,500. It was within the verbal estimate, but seeing it in black and white was different. He knew how she would react. He quickly walked to the jet, meeting her at the base of the air stairs. "The work is complete," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mr. Vance has sent the invoice." "And," she asked, not breaking her stride. "He's asking for $68,500. Julianne stopped, one foot on the first step. She turned slowly and looked at him. "He's what?" It's a highly detailed invoice, Julianne. It includes component costs for parts that are no longer manufactured, and..." She held up a hand, silencing him. She took the tablet from his hand and looked at the invoice. Her eyes narrowed. She scrolled down, her expression hardening with every line item. Component-level logic board refurbishment. What is this nonsense? I told him to fix a light, not rebuild the airplane. This is extortion. The chief pilot said he ran a full diagnostic and the system is performing perfectly, David offered weakly. He said the man was incredibly thorough. I'm sure he was, she sneered. Thoroughly padding his bill. Get him on the phone. David hesitated. Julianne, perhaps we should just pay it. The jet is ready, we need to get to Zurich. Get him on the phone, David, she repeated, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Now. David retreated a few steps and made the call. Elias answered on the second ring. His voice was calm, awake. David explained the situation, that Miss Croft felt the bill was excessive. He could hear the weary sigh on the other end of the line. The bill is for the work performed, Elias said simply. It is correct. She'd like to offer you $20,000, David said, wincing as he spoke the words. As a settlement for your time. There was a long silence from Elias's end. Then, no. That's the offer, David said helplessly. Then my answer is no. The price is the price. Julianne snatched the phone from David's hand. Mr. Vance. This is Julianne Croft. Let me be perfectly clear. You have two options. You can accept $20,000, wired to you immediately, as payment in full for your services. Or, you can receive nothing. I will have my legal team bury you in so much litigation for fraudulent billing that you'll be selling that little garage of yours to pay the fees. Which will it be? Elias's voice remained utterly calm, a stark contrast to her barely controlled fury. The work was completed as requested. The price is on the invoice. You have my account information. This is not a negotiation, you arrogant little man. You are a mechanic in a shed. I am giving you a gracious way out. Take the 20,000-inch. The work is documented, Miss Croft, Elias said, and there was a new, hard edge to his voice. The repair is logged. You have until 9 o'clock this morning to remit the full payment. If you choose not to, I will be forced to follow standard FAA reporting procedure for an uncertified major repair. Is that a threat? She hissed. It is a statement of fact. Have a good day, he hung up. Julianne stared at the phone, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. No one hung up on her. No one. Uncertified repair? What is he talking about? He fixed it. The plane works, she yelled at David. The Form 337, David said, a dawning horror on his face. He had seen the draft attached to the invoice. Any major repair has to be signed off by the mechanic and submitted to the FAA. Without his signature on the final form, and a logbook entry stating the work is complete and the aircraft is approved for return to service, legally, the repair hasn't happened. Julianne's rage faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. So, what does that mean? It means, the chief pilot said, stepping forward, his face grim, that this aircraft is not airworthy. And if he reports it as an open, uncertified repair, the FAA will issue a grounding order. Not just for this jet. For our entire fleet, until the issue is resolved. Everything under our operating certificate. The full weight of the situation crashed down on Julianne Croft. This was not about money anymore. This was about leverage. And the quiet, unassuming mechanic in the flannel shirt, the man she had dismissed and insulted, was holding a lever that could bring her entire $10 billion empire to a grinding halt. Her velocity had just met an immovable object. At 9:01 a.m., Elias Vance, having received no payment, performed the final steps of his process. He took the draft Form 337, attached a printed copy of the unpaid invoice, and wrote across the top in neat, block letters, "Work completed, payment refused, aircraft not approved for return TO service." He placed the documents in a certified mail envelope addressed to the local FAA Flight Standards District Office. He drove to the post office and sent it. The action was quiet, simple, and irreversible. He had not acted out of anger or a desire for revenge. He had simply followed the procedure that the regulations demanded. The system, he knew, would do the rest. The call came to Julianne's chief of operations at 10:47 a.m. It was from the FAA. A formal inquiry had been opened regarding a reported uncertified major repair on aircraft N900JC, a Gulfstream G650 registered to Croft Executive Air. As per federal regulations, the airworthiness certificate for that aircraft was temporarily suspended. And because it was the flagship of their Part 135 charter certificate, the certificate for the entire fleet was suspended along with it. All Croft Executive Air aircraft were grounded, effective immediately. The news spread through the company like a shockwave. Flights were cancelled. High-profile clients were left stranded. The logistical and financial fallout was catastrophic, growing with every passing minute. Julianne sat in her office, the view of the city skyline seeming to mock her. She had built an empire on the promise of seamless, immediate travel, and in the space of a few hours, a single mechanic had brought it to its knees. Not with lawyers, not with threats, but with a piece of paper and a postage stamp. Her first instinct was to fight. She had her legal team on a conference call within minutes, 4 of the most expensive aviation lawyers in the country. Their assessment was unanimous and brutal. Vance was in the right. He had performed the work, and until he signed the logbooks and the final 337, the aircraft was legally a pumpkin. Any attempt to fly it would result in massive fines and the possible revocation of her entire operating certificate. Suing him for fraudulent billing would take years, and in the meantime, her company would bleed to death. They were checkmated. "Pay him," her lead counsel said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Pay the men, get the signature, and get your planes back in the air. There is no other move." Humiliation was a foreign feeling to Julianne Croft, and it tasted like ash. She had to go to him. She had to stand in that greasy little hangar and admit defeat. She took David Chin with her, a silent witness to her surrender. They found Elias in his hangar, sweeping the concrete floor. He was wearing the same flannel shirt. The vast, empty space seemed to amplify the quiet dignity of his work. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. He did not seem surprised or triumphant. He simply waited. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice strained. "There has been a misunderstanding." Elias leaned the broom against a workbench. "I don't believe there has. My company has been grounded. I need your signature to resolve the situation." "I am aware," he said. The quiet, factual nature of his responses infuriated her more than any gloating could have. He was not playing a game. He was simply existing in a state of correctness that she could not breach. "I am prepared to wire the full amount of your invoice," she said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. Elias nodded. "And the service restoration fee?" Julianne stared at him. "The what?" "My friend, Marcus Thorne, a lawyer, advised me that the administrative work involved in rectifying this situation with the FAA would incur additional professional time. He drew up an invoice for it. It's for $25,000, he slid a piece of paper across the workbench toward her. Julianne's face went white with rage. This was the final indignity. "You," she started, but David Chin put a hand on her arm. "Julianne, please," he whispered. "Just pay it." She looked from David's pleading face to Elias's calm, unyielding one. She saw no malice there. Only a quiet insistence on the principle of the thing. Work performed requires payment. A problem created requires a solution. She had created a problem. This was the price of the solution. She took out her phone and, with trembling, furious fingers, authorized the wire transfer for the full $93,500. A moment later, a confirmation appeared on Elias's laptop. He watched the screen, then nodded once. He walked over to his desk, picked up a pen, and signed the completed Form 337. He made a formal entry in the aircraft's logbook, his handwriting neat and precise. Major repair to Collins Pro Line 4 interface bridge completed. System tested and found to be fully operational. Aircraft is approved for return to service. He signed and dated it, adding his license number. He handed the logbook and the FAA forms to her. "You will need to fax these to the FSDO," he said. "They should lift the grounding order within the hour." Julianne took the documents. They felt impossibly heavy. She had won countless negotiations, crushed competitors, and bent markets to her will. But she had been utterly defeated by a quiet man who believed in doing a job properly and getting paid for it. She turned and walked out of the hangar without another word, the silence of her retreat a stark admission of his victory. The story of what happened to Croft Executive Air did not make the news, but it traveled swiftly through the closed community of corporate aviation. It was told in hushed tones by chief pilots, directors of maintenance, and FBO managers. It was a cautionary tale about arrogance, but more than that, it was the origin story of a legend. Elias Vance's phone began to ring. It was not corporations calling, but the senior maintenance managers themselves, the old hands who knew the difference between a part swapper and a true diagnostician. They came to him with their impossible problems, the ghost-in-the-machine faults that had stumped the manufacturers. A recurring pressurization issue on a Falcon 8X. A navigation drift on a brand-new Praetor 600. An engine vibration on a Challenger 350 that no one could trace. Elias took on the work, but on his own terms. He did not travel. The aircraft, or the components, came to him. His prices were high, and they were non-negotiable. His invoices were paid, without question, the moment they were sent. He hired 2 other mechanics, men like him, veterans from defunct aerospace programs who had been cast aside by corporate mergers. They were men who cared about the work, who found deep satisfaction in solving a complex problem correctly. His small hangar became a sort of specialized hospital for the most difficult cases in private aviation. He never advertised. He did not need to. His reputation, built on a foundation of quiet competence and absolute integrity, was more powerful than any marketing campaign. He used the money to buy better equipment, a 5-axis CNC mill, an environmental testing chamber, advanced spectrum analyzers. But his life did not change. He still wore the same flannel shirts. He still drove the same old truck. And every evening, he was still home for dinner with Leo. The business was a means to an end, to provide a stable, peaceful life for his son and to do the work he was meant to do, free from the compromises and corruptions of the corporate world. One cool autumn evening, months after the incident with Julianne Croft, Elias and Leo sat at the workbench, side by side. Elias was patiently explaining the principles of a gyroscope, using a simple spinning top as an example. Leo watched, his face a mask of concentration, his mind absorbing the complex physics with an easy grace. "So it stays stable because it's moving fast?" Leo asked. "That's part of it," Elias said. "But it's more about inertia. It has a memory of where it's supposed to be. It resists any force that tries to knock it off its axis. The faster it spins, the more it wants to stay true." Leo nodded, understanding. He looked around the hangar, at the gleaming tools and the half-disassembled jet engine on a stand. He looked at his father. "Are you like that, Dad?" he asked. "Like a gyroscope?" Elias stopped, surprised by the question. He thought about the life he had left behind, the pressures and temptations he had faced. He thought about Julianne Croft, a force of immense velocity and leverage, and how she had tried to knock him from his axis. He had not fought back with her weapons. He had not tried to match her speed or her force. He had simply held his position, spinning on a core of principles, honesty, craftsmanship, his promise to his wife. He had stayed true. He put his arm around his son's shoulders and pulled him close. "I try to be," he said, his voice quiet in the vast, peaceful space of the hangar. "I try to be." In the end, the world had not bent to Julianne Croft's will. It had bent, as it always does, to the immutable laws of physics, and to the quiet, unwavering integrity of a man who understood them.